Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. American's Moments in History. Today, we're going to be continuing to look at this time period of Reconstruction, and a lot of our conversation today is going to center around this new role for African Americans and some of the challenges that came about during Reconstruction, and we'll build off of that, but this is going to be kind of that third of four segments that we're going to talk about Reconstruction here. So as far as our main idea, kind of our learning target for today, we're going to be able to explain how, as African Americans began to take a larger role in society, and certainly, with the 13th Amendment being passed and starting to see Reconstruction being more in the process of creating this new society, particularly in the South, we're going to see that as they take a bigger part in civil life in the South, that they're going to face resistance. And that resistance includes violence, particularly against former Confederate sympathizers and typically people of European ancestry. And so what we're going to look at today is some of that struggle and some of those changes. So we should note that African Americans begin to, especially with the right to vote now, they're going to, for African American men, let me amend that by saying African American men can vote right now. Women unfortunately can't yet at this point in history. They're never going to control any state's government, but you are going to see that African Americans are going to be elected, and you're going to see them hold more public office, and they're going to play an important role in Reconstruction politics. And I want to bring a couple of examples to you. So Hiram Revels is the first African American to be elected to the U.S. Senate. And he's going to be elected to the Senate in 1870, and in a role and in a seat that was probably at one point controlled by Jefferson Davis. So certainly a connection there to the change that we see going on throughout the South and throughout the United States. You're also going to want to maybe note Blanche K Bruce. Unlike Revels, Bruce is a former slave an informed enslaved person. We should note that being a slave shouldn't define a person. Was also elected to the Senate in 1874. And between roughly about 1869 to about 1880, we're going to see 16 African Americans serve in the House of Representatives. So it's still not this landslide of African Americans entering into politics, but it's a lot of progress in a pretty short amount of time as far as their role in the government goes. Now, certainly noting Reconstruction politics, it should be noted that neither the North or the South is, everybody all believes the same thing. There's a lot of differences in opinions here. And you do have some Southerners who actually support Republican ideas, including radical Republican ideas. And in the South, former Confederates often referred to these people as scalawags. And they're seen by these former Confederates as kind of almost traitors to their cause. And to the cause that they believe that they fought the war for. Northerners also are starting to come into the South, and because of the destruction and because of a loss of a lot of income and economic hardship, some Northerners are coming in and they're taking advantage of that situation to buy land to buy land that would be cheaper at this point in history than in other places, and it makes it more difficult for Southern people to compete, perhaps with that wealth coming from the North. And so when they're moving to the South, these Northerners are often sometimes called carpetbaggers, as that they are taking advantage of the economic situation in the South. You also have many Southerners who look at this whole process of Reconstruction in the government as just full of corruption, which is one of our vocab words. It means dishonesty or dishonest action or even illegal actions in some cases. And so there's still a great deal of resentment, and that's not going away anytime soon. This is still a pretty fresh wound for the Confederacy and its, or I should say the former Confederate states now in the United States, and transitioning back into the Union, it's not going to go away anytime soon. Most Southern whites at this point in history, so people of European ancestry, they opposed efforts to expand African American rights. And what you start to begin to see is some of these white Southerners begin to create secret societies. A couple of examples, you of course have the Ku Klux Klan. You also have the White League also. And they used fear and violence, and in some cases they killed African Americans to try to deny them rights, both to freedmen and freed women, particularly of African American descent. They tried to stop them from exercising these new rights that they had, including to vote. And the people who were joining these groups, especially planters as well as some Southern Democrats, had the most to gain from this return to more of an idea of white European ancestry Americans having a sense of supremacy, or what we might call white supremacy. That's that idea of being superior to all others in authorities. And you can see this a little bit with the black codes, and then a little bit later in the history of this Reconstruction with what we refer to as Jim Crow, which we'll talk about more next time. So, quick discussion question, quick check-in question here. Southern whites who supported Republicans, what were they known as? A, scalawags, B, sharecroppers, C, carpetbaggers, or D, freedmen. Take a moment if you need to, pause the video if you need to, but the best answer here is scalawags. All right, shifting gears a little bit, we're going to talk a little bit about education. So one of the things that African Americans did definitely not have equal access to prior to Reconstruction was education. And I'm going to use this term because it was in use during the time period, and depending on your own beliefs, as far as the role that race plays, if it even exists at all, you may believe that all human beings are members of the human race and that there's only one race. But I'm going to use this because it's the term that was used in this time period in identifying both African Americans and white Americans, or Americans of European ancestry in the South. So you're going to see education improve, but you're also going to see the introduction of sharecropping, which is the system that limits economic opportunities for African Americans, and we're going to get more into that in just a little bit. So Reconstruction in the governments here, they created public schools and academies, again, for African Americans and for white Americans, or Americans of European ancestry. Again, I'm going to use that term here because it refers to the time period and the views that people in the time period held. And I'm not trying to condone it either way, and depending on what you believe, that might be a term you wouldn't use today. A few states required that schools began to integrate, and the vocab word here, that means to end separation. So there wouldn't be a school for just African Americans or just white Americans. There'd be a school in which they were mixed. But the laws were typically not enforced. And so you are going to see later on under Plessy versus Ferguson, there's going to be that separation. And then to wrap things up here, what was the relationship between sharecroppers and landowners? Landowners owned sharecroppers. Landowners sold small parcels of land to sharecroppers. Sharecroppers rented the parcels of land. Or D, sharecroppers worked the landowner's land for a small annual salary. Best answer here is C. And part of the reason why sharecropping was so devastating is because it essentially replaces slavery in the idea that people who were sharecropping were still subservient to people who owned land, and it increased debt and never gave sharecroppers a real fair chance at trying to build equity towards buying their own land. They were always going to be stuck in this. So that's where we're going to wrap it up for today for this third section. For my students, make sure you've been following along with the guided notes. If you've just been listening, I hope that we've kind of improved or gave you some insight into this time period of Reconstruction. Have a wonderful day, and thanks for listening.